With the release of Stasis and Beyond Light, we were introduced with a completely new way to control ads. Of the many Stasis builds that have come to light, one has remained the most overpowered, making the hardest endgame pieces of content seem like a joke. What's going on, guys? It's G Miners here, and today we're going over the best Stasis turret builds and how to utilize them in endgame content. In this video, I will be covering two variants of the build. The first is an overall build that has options for ad clear and a bit more survivability. The second has potential to combine with elemental well builds, which could be much more useful, but ultimately will be a riskier style of play. Starting off with the first build, the aspects that I like to run are Bleak Watcher and Ice Flare Bolts. Bleak Watcher converts your grenade into a stasis turret that will slow and eventually freeze enemies. When killing a frozen enemy, Ice Flare Bolts will spawn a Seeker that instantly freezes another ad that is nearby. These two will end up pairing extremely well together by allowing you to freeze large groups of ads very quickly by getting a single frozen kill. Looking at the fragments, Whisper of Torment is used to help generate grenade energy when taking damage. Whisper of Durance allows enemies who are frozen to stay frozen longer and will increase the turret's lifetime. This is especially helpful when under light, as it will require more time to kill red bars. Whisper of Chains will allow you to take less damage against enemies as long as we are near enemies that we have frozen. And lastly, Whisper of Fissures will make the explosions from killing frozen enemies much larger, and they will deal more damage. This will once again pair extremely well with Ice Flare Bolts and allow us to ad clear enemies that are close together or spawn at the same point. The grenade that I use is the Duskfield grenade. This has the lowest base cooldown by far, and it's great for freezing large groups if you need faster freezing than the Bleak Watcher. The Bleak Watcher aspect has its own base cooldown, and I'm not sure if that overrides the Duskfield nade or if the game takes both into account. I always run my Stasis turret builds with the exotic helmet Eye of Another World. This exotic will provide increased regen for all abilities across the board, which is going to be extremely useful for keeping the Bleak Watcher turret out at almost all times. Verity's Brow is another great exotic for this and can even be better if used right. I personally don't use Verity's because it revolves around using a stasis weapon, which I am not always using with this build. Verity's also gives grenade damage, but the stasis turrets do negligible damage, so this ultimately does nothing. And lastly, it also gives increased regen for teammates after you throw a grenade. But seeing as you are not always going to be near your teammates, this ability is hit or miss in my opinion. Before I get into the second build, if you found this video useful, don't forget to drop a like and sub down below. Subbing helps me out a ton, it is completely free, and you can always change your mind later. The second build that we have is similar, but revolves around utilizing stasis shards. Here, we will be using the aspects Bleak Watcher and Glacial Harvest. Glacial Harvest will allow us to generate stasis shards each time that we freeze targets. For the fragments, just like the first build, we will be using Whisper of Chains for damage reduction and Whisper of Torment for increased grenade energy. New to this build, we will be using Whisper of Conduction, which will cause the shards that we generate by freezing ads to track to our position within a few meters. Also, we will be using Whisper of Rhyme to slowly generate an overshield as we collect these stasis shards. This will last 10 seconds, but can be infinitely refreshed. By using stasis shards, we are also able to use the mod Elemental Shards. This allows each shard to count as an elemental well, which can be used to generate ability energy and charge you with light. In order to keep this video short, I am not going over any extra well mods, but I just figured I'd mention elemental shards because it's an extremely overpowered mod with huge potential for builds. Between these two, I think that the first build is going to be a better way to go for overall endgame content. It doesn't rely too heavily on anything and can be paired with any armor mods that you choose. You can run a full Charge with Light, Warmind Cell, or Elemental Well build and still have consistent stasis turrets and good survivability in the endgame. The second build somewhat forces your hand to go the Elemental Well route for armor mods. I also think that the fragments for stasis shards are a bit underwhelming. One fragment is dedicated to making shards track to your position. This could be changed, but is definitely going to be needed in endgame content where you're pinned to a certain position. And the other mod only gives you a tiny portion of an overshield each time you get a shard, so you need to be consistently freezing enemies. When using these builds, both can be paired with mods like Double Bomber on Solar class items or even Double Grenade Kickstart on Stasis arms to provide large chunks of your grenade energy back. Also, using a Demolitionist weapon makes generating turrets way more effective. I mentioned this in my previous video, but ultimately the goal with these turret builds is to be able to keep one turret out at all times. This allows you to lock down one ad spawn easily or even helps hold a position. Other than that, in the end game, the focus for this build is obviously surviving, which is achieved with some of the fragments and by allowing you to have great crowd control. There are other builds and activities with thousands of ads that will allow you to have 5+ grenades out at once, but these are not going to work when under light and when dealing with champions left and right. If you are new and want to see the mods I suggest putting on this build, I will have a link in the description below for my favorite and easiest to use endgame build. This build will work like a charm for the day 1 Witch Queen raid and content like GMs and Master Vogue, so I highly recommend you check it out. Anyways guys, that's all I have for this video. Hope this helps. Peace.